So Canada just finished something massive, and most people had no idea that it happened. 10 days ago, while the tariff headlines were eating every front page, Ottawa signed a free trade deal with Ecuador. Now, that sounds like a routine announcement, right? But it's anything but.
Because with Ecuador locked in, Canada now has free trade agreements with every single country on South America's Pacific coast. That's Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. Every single one. The Pacific Wall date is complete. And Washington helped build it by being so insufferable that Canada had no choice but to construct an exit.
For the last 18 months, Trump was threatening tariffs and Polyev was whining like a little baby. Carney's team was doing something far more consequential in the background.
They were building the infrastructure to make the U.S. market optional. Not tomorrow, not next year, but on a trajectory that is now locked in by signed agreements and trade relationships that don't get unsigned when the American political winds shift. The wall is up, the door is open, and Washington missed it completely.
Figures, right? When Carney's government took office, they set a specific concrete target: double Canada's non-US trade by 2035. And the way you get to double it is not by hoping that Washington gets its act together. That's not happening anytime soon. It's by signing deals, building corridors, and reducing the cost of alternatives until the math permanently changes in Canada's favor. And this is where the Ecuador deal sits inside of a much larger picture. Prime Minister Carney has now signed trade agreements with more than 20 foreign nations. The EU relationship, it's deepening. The UK deal is active. The Indo-Pacific strategy is producing signed agreements. The Pacific Alliance corridor, Chile, Peru, Colombia, was already in place. So each deal made the American market less indispensable. Each corridor made the dependency math slightly less lopsided, and Ecuador was the final piece of that specific wall. And on July 24th, that wall was sealed.
Ecuador's minister flew all the way from South America to Ottawa just for this. At a moment when every country is watching North American trade wars and deciding which side of this equation to build toward, well, Ecuador just picked the side with 20 trade agreements and a completed Pacific corridor. That tells you everything about where the world thinks this is going.
It's
Canada for the win!
It certainly does. You got it. Woohoo! Go Canada! So, what makes this Pacific Wall so important anyway? Well, it's that the effects, they're immediate. As of July 24th, 99.6% of Ecuador's goods now enter Canada completely tariff-free, effective immediately upon ratification of this. So it's happening right now. Ecuador removes duties on 97.2% of all Canadian goods, covering the entire product range. More than 600 specific product categories gain zero duty access on day one. We're talking bananas, cocoa, shrimp, tropical fruits, fresh cut flowers, precious metals, petroleum oils.
This means a lot for Canadian consumers as well as Canadian food security. Canada currently imports cocoa, bananas, shrimp, and tropical agriculture largely through American intermediaries or tariff-subject channels. Now, with the Ecuador Free Trade Agreement, it creates a direct, duty-free food corridor to one of the most productive agricultural countries in South America. It's now bypassing the American supply chains entirely.
So the next time Trump decides to flip the switch on tariffs or do anything like that and restrict Canadian access to some supply chains, well, Canada now has a direct Pacific route to Ecuadorian agriculture that operates completely outside of any of his leverage.
And what most people miss is that Ecuador is a gateway, not just a supplier. It sits on the Pacific Rim with direct access to shipping lanes that run west to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Indo-Pacific. When you overlay Ecuador on the existing Chilean, Peruvian, and Colombian agreements, you're not looking at 4 separate bilateral relationships. You're looking at a continuous, unbroken maritime corridor all the way down the Pacific coast of South America. Every port on that coastline is now inside Canada's preferential trade network. That's a geographic position that took 2 years to build and will stay in place no matter what Trump says.
Canada was already doing a massive amount of trade with Ecuador before the free trade agreement made it official. Two-way merchandise trade between Canada and Ecuador hit 2 billion Canadian dollars in 2025, up 2.9% year over year. Ecuador is Canada's sixth largest merchandise trading partner in all of South America, and that ranking is about to move up considerably as the zero duty access kicks in and Canadian exporters start routing business through the new corridor. The economic logic here is just right in your face, and it just makes sense. And what that means for Canadian trade in practical terms is that goods can now move through Vancouver and Prince Rupert, two of the most capable port complexes on the Pacific Rim, into a preferential corridor that covers the entire Pacific coast of South America and connects through Pacific shipping lanes directly to Asia.
Canada's exposure to the American market hasn't disappeared, and it won't disappear next year, but it is demonstrably, contractually, much smaller than it was on the day that Carney took office. And it gets smaller with every agreement that gets ratified. Trump's protection racket only works when there's no other landlord in the building, and Canada is just leased the entire floor below the North American continent.
Speaking of that floor, let's take a look at what's happening in the dumpster fires south of the border, because you can't fully understand what Canada just built without seeing what's happening in the US.
American farmers are facing accumulated losses that exceed $50 billion across the sector over the past 3 crop years. On the trade side, America's agricultural trade deficit, what the U.S. has to import versus what it can export, is expected to hit $41.5 billion this year. The country that wrote the rules of global agricultural trade is running a $41.5 billion annual deficit, U.S., in the sector that it was supposed to dominate.
China's retaliatory tariffs alone cost American agriculture $14.9 billion in lost export revenue in a single year, March 2025 to February 2026. That's $14.9 billion in food exports that used to flow into the largest consumer market on earth, and now they don't. We're talking America's soybeans, corn, wheat, all sitting in storage or being rerouted through secondary buyers at lower margins, while the suppliers fill the Chinese gap permanently.
And here's the number that captures the situation the most clearly. The USDA paid $12 billion in what they called bridge payments. These are emergency taxpayer-funded transfers to American farmers hurt by the tariff strategy it created itself. Trump launched the trade war, and the farmers absorbed the losses, and the farmers voted for Trump again and again. And the government had to write a $12 billion emergency check to cover the damage. They borrowed from American taxpayers to compensate American farmers for the consequences of an American policy.
So let's put the two pictures side by side here. Canada, you've got the Pacific Wall completed on July 24th, 20 plus active trade agreements, non-US trade on trajectory to double by 2035, and agricultural supply lanes diversified across 4 Pacific corridor countries. Then you got the United States, $44 billion in farm losses, $41.5 billion of agricultural trade deficit, $12 billion in emergency payments to its own farmers, and still no deal with Canada. The gap between those two pictures, it's not a coincidence at all. It's basically the result of two governments making opposite decisions about how to respond to the exact same situation.
Trump just assumed his insane tariff strategy would produce major Canadian concessions. Instead, Canada held. And we talked about this in our last 2 videos about how much better Canada is doing than the United States, and you can check it below. Because Washington, they assumed agricultural leverage would force Ottawa's hand. Instead, Canada built around it. Trump assumed Canadian business pressure would bring Carney to the table. Instead, Carney signed 20 more deals. Every assumption this plan was built on has failed to produce the result that Trump wanted.
The facts, they're just undeniable. The cleared sale, it's over. The exits are open, and Canada spent 2 years building trade infrastructure that systematically reduces exposure to American economic pressure, one signed deal at a time. The Ecuador Free Trade Agreement is the final brick in a wall that was being built the entire time, and it was completed 10 days ago while most of the world was just watching something else.
And that's how this was always going to work. Not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a foundation quietly poured, until one day, Washington looks up and realizes the leverage it thought it had was already gone.
So here's a question for you guys today, and we really want to hear from you on this. So Washington knows that the Pacific Wall exists. The trade deficit is climbing. The farmer losses are real. So at what point does Trump come back to Carney with an actual deal? Not a deadline, not a threat, but a genuine offer. Do you think this is actually going to happen?
And hey, if you want to check out any travels in Peru, Ecuador, or Chile, we've got it in our travel channel, The Planet D Travel, that you can check in the links below, because they are beautiful countries and I'm so excited to be trading with them.
As always, throw your comments down there. Check out the pinned comment for our merch store, the Facebook group, and the Substack.
And give it a hype and a like and share it with someone who needs to see this, because the people that are voting for Trump and PP, they're not watching this. So we got to get the word out there.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.